Welcome back to Kaleidoscope. Well, if you are a viewer of this show and others like it, I'm sure you will have come across discussion of the World Economic Forum, or WEF, an unelected body of the super rich who, headed by the likes of Bill Gates, are quietly collaborating with politicians worldwide to change the global economy in the wake of the pandemic. And one figure you will have heard of is everyone's least favourite globalist, Klaus Schwab, the founder of the World Economic Forum and the father of stakeholder capitalism, which I will get into with my next guest. Well, many of you will be pleased to know that Klausy has stepped down as executive chairman of the WEF. But is this a good thing for the future of the planet, or does it just pave the way for someone even more extreme to fill his place? Joining me to discuss all of that and more is Emeritus Professor Ruben Rose. Professor Rose, it is so lovely to have you here this evening. How are you?
Daisy, thanks for having me on.
Well, it's very lovely to chat. I mean, this is quite a big development in the WEF. Klaus has been heading up that organisation for 50 years or more. So he is stepping down. What do you think this means for the WEF moving forward?
Well, Klaus is 86 years old, so it probably is time for him to step down. although Joe Biden will be 86 at the end of his next term of presidency if he's re-elected, so I suppose it's not that unusual. But I think the situation with Klaus that's really interesting is that he's been very influential across, as you say, a 50-year period. And he came back from the Kennedy School of Government, where he was a protege of Henry Kissinger, in 1971, and started what he called the European Management Forum. So it was a sort of a group of Europeans together to try and plan out economic options for the future. And it morphed into what he called the World Economic Forum in 1987. And so there's been a long history, and it's gradually gathered momentum and people. So it's become bigger than Ben-Hur. Klaus himself has gathered a range of degrees. He's got 17 honorary doctorates, apart from his original degrees in economics and in engineering. So he's a very influential guy, and you only have to see him at the various meetings with Ursula von der Leyen and others. He refers to her as Dear Ursula, and she calls him Dear Klaus. He's become very close to the rich and powerful, and the World Economic Forum has become extraordinarily influential. So I think it is interesting that he's standing down, but it's unlikely to have a big impact on the trajectory, which is already extremely important and has gained such a lot of credibility with the powerful industrialists and also the politicians.
I mean, he's become sort of an iconic cult-like figure. It doesn't really help that he sort of looks like Darth Vader without his gear on. It makes him look a little bit spookier. Now, look, do you think we should be pleased that Schwab is stepping down, or, as I mentioned, does this just pave the way for someone even more radical to take the reins?
Well, it's already got an extraordinary network of people associated with it. I just had a look this morning to look at who's on the board of trustees, for instance, and there's 29 people, and they include people like Queen Rania of Jordan, Al Gore, the president of the World Bank, the president of the IMF, the president of the WTO, the director general of CERN. It goes on and on through the European Central Bank, the president of Singapore, also, groups like the CEOs of Accenture and Nestle and Bain and BlackRock and Salesforce. So there's this extraordinary grouping, and then there's a managing board of 7, which also includes Klaus's son, Olivier, and then there's an executive committee of 37. So I think Klaus has put a structure well in place that when he's gone, there's going to still be the extraordinary agents of influence. And, of course, the World Economic Forum has tied itself pretty closely with the United Nations as well, and the 17 Sustainable Goals. So these are the ultra-globalists who believe that there's a group of people that should be in charge of the world.
And it's very, very scary because, as I said, these are unelected people, a lot of them, who think that they can sort of dictate how the little people live. It reminds me of a sort of neo-feudalism, where the feudal lords, owned everything and could give and take from the populace as they saw fit, depending what they thought the populace needed, and there was no mobility or anything like that. So it's a regressive ideology, and we do know the WEF is planning what they call a great reset of capitalism, and that also far too many global leaders are on board with it, although they won't admit it. Oh, it's not that, it's just sustainability, but it's not. So I know this might be a bit of a gargantuan task in the time we have, but could you maybe explain for our viewers what that great reset entails and, well, the implications for life as we know it as it goes ahead?
It's a good question, Daisy, and it's very hard to explain very quickly, although I have read all of Klaus's work and his book on the Fourth Industrial Revolution, the Great Reset, and what he also called the Great Narrative. The books came out in 20 and 22. I think the Great Reset captured people's attention because the idea came out in June 2020, just at the time of the peak of the COVID crisis. And so Klaus came out with this extraordinary story, which is, now is the time. Now is the propitious time. And it sort of got, oh my goodness, what's this all about? And I think the simplest explanation is the 90-second clip that the WEF put out themselves, where it had that great line, "You'll own nothing and be happy. By 2030, you'll own nothing and be happy." And so it's an extraordinary sort of idea, which is, basically just give us everything. Don't want to own anything. We'll look after you and you'll be happy. And so the Great Reset really is all about the story of handing over power to a global organization. And, what Klaus says, it's really about greater cooperation and greater global cooperation. But it's interesting because this idea has its roots long ago, of course, and it takes you back to the technocracy movement of the 1930s, where there was also a group of people that believed that basically scientists and engineers need to be in charge of the world. We can't just leave it to people and politicians who will make bad decisions, but hand the power over to us and all will be well. I think that's the heart of it, is that the group like Klaus saw COVID and other crises, they call them polycrises, as the opportunity, a narrow window of opportunity, Klaus said, to reflect, reimagine, and reset our world. So that's what Klaus said himself. And so that's sort of the idea, and it's very hard to take hold of it. But I think that idea of by 2030 you'll own nothing and be happy is probably the best summary of it, Daisy.
Well, yes, exactly, because I always interpret that not as a promise, but as an instruction. It's not, you'll own nothing and be happy. It's you will own nothing and you will be happy. That's how I interpret it. It's very, very insidious. And the thing is, down here, tucked in Australia's own little pocket of the world, it's tempting to think that we're a little bit insulated from all of that, but we're really not. I mean, our own federal treasurer, poor old Jim Chalmers, wrote a 6,000-word essay, a dissertation last year about what he calls values-based capitalism, which is, the notion that everything a company does has a kind of, they have a social responsibility for every decision they make, which to a point can be valuable. You don't want to spew toxic waste in a village, for instance, but eventually it just becomes completely indulgent and makes people's lives a lot harder by driving up power prices and the price of goods, and, it becomes about control. But this values-based capitalism, isn't that just the same as the stakeholder capitalism that Klaus Schwab and the WEF talk about?
Look, I think in essence it is. I've read the 6,000-word essay of Dr. Chalmers, and it's like a stream of consciousness. It's really hard to come to grips with what it is. He talks about capitalism after the crises is the title, but it's then just a stream of consciousness, and it's very hard to put your finger on the story. I think the link is to both the WEF and what Dr. Chalmers was writing about. It's a utopianism of the story of just, give us more power, trust us, and we'll just do an amazing thing. It's Chalmers himself talks about, a system where Australians and business are clear and active participants in shaping a better society. Well, who doesn't want that? But the problem is, to do that, all these guys want more control and they want to spend more of our money. And I think it's exactly the opposite. It's exactly the opposite to President Reagan's famous quote from 1986, where he said, "The 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, 'I'm from the government and I'm here to help.'" And so I think that's the heart of the story. It's bigger government. Trust us, we'll do all the right things by you. And the whole idea of stakeholder capitalism is not about profits, but serving a group of stakeholders, which are hard to define who they are, but it's basically everyone in the world.
Yes, exactly. And the problem with
And
this idea... Oh, no, sorry, I interrupted you. Go ahead, please, Professor.
I was just thinking the other thing that Dr. Sharma said is that we can build something better, more meaningful, and more inclusive. So they're all sort of motherhood statements, but it's hard to sort of get a grasp on what it is. But it really is about, energy transition, taking into account the climate and what we need to do, giving the government more power and giving the more government more authority. And so that's at the heart of what that essay is about. But my goodness, it's a hard read,
Yes,
and
it
I've read it a
is.
number of times. And it's just it's like Jim sat down over. He said he finished it on New Year's Eve, and with a
God.
few glasses of wine, he just wrote a whole lot of things that came to mind.
It does read a bit like that. I've read it too. I made a YouTube video on it. I put myself through it so other people don't have to. But it is, again, it's these weird utopian statements that are ultimately impractical, because ultimately everyone has different ideas of what a better world actually looks like. So ultimately, unless you force people at the point of a gun, none of it's actually going to work. We have to jump to a break there, ladies and gentlemen, but don't go anywhere, because we are going to talk to Professor Ruben Rose about something very interesting: transhumanism. Don't go anywhere.